Hi guys, and I just thought I'd make this video for anybody that was missing, so that you could hear the information that I gave about the Fenians. And the Fenians are one of our revolutionary groups that we look at in this course. And as with the other revolutionary groups, I think the key thing to remember about the Fenians is it's not really important. The actual detail about the revolution isn't important. What's more important is the legacy they leave. Trying to understand why the revolution failed, I suppose, is important in terms of how the government deals with them. But with the Fenians in particular, the legacy that they leave is incredibly important. Okay, just a wee word about the Fenians. The Fenians are sometimes referred to as the Irish Republican Brotherhood. They are actually two organisations, two sides of the one coin, I suppose, the best way to think about it. But the Fenian movements, or the Fenians, generally covers both. So one branch was formed by James Stephens in 1858 in Dublin. Okay, and that was known as the Irish Republican Brotherhood. The other branch was formed in New York by John O'Mahony at the same time on St. Patrick's Day in 1858, and that was called the Fenian Brotherhood, but they're both referred to as Fenians. James Stephens, we talked about before. James Stephens was the guy who escaped from the 1848 rebellion by faking his own funeral, went off to Paris, and had returned to Ireland in the 1850s and walked around, done a 3,000-mile walk around Ireland to sort of gauge the mood of the Irish people and the condition of the Irish people, and to see whether the Irish people were ready for rebellion. John O'Mahony, as you can see from his uniform, was involved in the American Civil War. He also had been a young Irelander. He had been transported from Ireland and ended up in America, eventually fighting on the Union side in the American Civil War. So there's a link there with the Young Ireland Rebellion of 1848. Just a wee bit about the Fenian Brotherhood and IRB. So they were a secret, oath-bound society. You weren't allowed to reveal your membership to anyone unless you were an official at an official IRB or Fenian event. And there's a copy of their oath that they swore. In the presence of God, I do solemnly swear that I will do my utmost to establish the independence of Ireland, and that I can bear true allegiance to the Supreme Council of the Irish Republican Brotherhood and the government of the Irish Republic, and implicitly obey the Constitution of the Irish Republican Brotherhood and all my superior officers, and that I will preserve inviolable the secrets of the organization. So it's a secret organization where you swear a secret oath to keep it a secret, okay? And that's one of the reasons why it falls foul of the Catholic Church in Ireland. The Catholic Church is always suspicious of secret organizations. And you can see that in one of the big propaganda events that the IRB organised, the funeral of Thomas Bellew McManus. Thomas Bellew McManus is not really important to this, other than the fact that his funeral is important to this, okay? Because it was used as a propaganda event by the IRB in 1861. So Thomas Bellew McManus, just to give you his backstory, he was another one of these 1848 revolutionaries, young Irelanders, who had been transported. He went to Tasmania and eventually escaped after a couple of years and ended up in America and died, obviously. And then the IRB and the Fenian Brotherhood raised money to have the body of Thomas Bellew McManus returned back to Ireland and buried in Ireland. And it was a huge propaganda event. But it was opposed by the Archbishop of the Catholic Church, the leading cleric in Ireland at the time, Archbishop Paul Cullen, who would later go on to become Cardinal Paul Cullen, a very, very important figure. And that's a quotation from Wikipedia there, where it says he was the most important Irish political figure in the 30 years between Daniel O'Connell and Charles Stewart Parnell. So it's really, really important that that you feel comfortable talking about Paul Cullen. Paul Cullen as opposed to the Fenians, and maybe this is one of the reasons why the Fenians don't succeed. So this is taken actually, this information here is taken, I'm going to try and move this because I'm not sure if you can see this. It's in the road, right. This is taken from, I think, a handout that I posted up on the Google Classroom earlier. It says, on the 10th of November 1861, an estimated 100,000 people showed up for the final trip of the Young Irelander. Almost 50,000 men marched in military uniform, with a greater number lined with a greater number lining the streets. Included along the way were numerous stops to tell the tales of hallowed spots of great fallen revolutionaries. These included the church in front of which Robert Emmet was hanged, the house where Wolfe Tone's body was prepared before its burial, and the house where Lord Edward Fitzgerald was shot. I think that was a murder during the 1803 rebellion. So you can see it is really a propaganda event. It says the church again tried to quell this flouting of its authority and refused to allow the body to rest in any church or give the dead man any funeral rites. So this was under Cullen's orders that the church should play no part in this propaganda event. But Father Patrick Lavelle, a previously secretive Fenian, defied Archbishop Cullen, and the body was laid in state in Abbey Street at the Mechanics' Institute, not even church. An oration written by James Stephens was delivered by Captain Smith in Glasnevin Cemetery. And again, I think this is actually taken from Unpublic, which is a Republican newspaper. So, but again, it shows you how Republicans view this. The funeral was a revival of the nationalist spirit, which had been thought dead after the famine and the failure of the 1848 rebellion. The IRB's ranks grew in size. It showed that the people were ready to honour the Fenian dead, and it was this funeral that was to inspire a future IRB man to orate. Life springs from death, and from the graves of patriot men and women spring living nations. Now, this quotation, you can go and read it yourself, but this is actually from Patrick Pearse. It's a speech that he gave at the grave of O'Donovan Rossa, who was another Fenian, in 1915, just before the 1916 Rising. So you're starting to see links between these revolutionary organisations, right from Emmet into the Young Irelanders, and now into the Fenians, and this will move forward into 1916, which is outside the realm of our course. Our course stops at 1900, but you know, you can make reference to it in a exam or essay, just to show that you're aware of where this ends up. That quotation just finishes off. The fools, they have left us our Fenian dead, and while Ireland holds these graves, Ireland unfree shall never be at peace. Some of you may have heard of that before. Now, the context for what the Fenians are operating on here is the American Civil War. The American Civil War ended in 1865, and Fenians had been involved in the American Civil War on both sides, mostly on the Union side, the Northern side. And with the Civil War now over, many Fenians wanted to take the war to Britain. And that involved attacks on Canada and a rebellion in Ireland. In 1866, there was actually a attack by the Fenians on Canada in an episode of history called the Fenian Raids, if you're ever interested in looking that up. In 1866, James Stephens travelled to the US to meet with the Brotherhood, with the American Fenians. As I said, the Fenian Brotherhood was keen to strike now. They were impatient, whereas Stephen wanted to delay, thinking that the time wasn't right. So Stephens was aware that the British had already shut down their newspaper and that habeas corpus had been suspended in Ireland, which meant that the authorities could arrest people without trial. So he thought the time wasn't right, but the American Fenians are very anxious to do something now that they've got these men who've just fresh out of the Civil War. They've got military training, they're battle hardened, and they're ready to rock. During his time in America, James Stephens actually is deposed as leader of the IRB, and Colonel Thomas Kelly, who you can see there, that's in his later years, on the left there, took over and immediately began planning for a rebellion. So it was the American Fenians who planned the rebellion in Ireland. That's probably give you some indication why it failed as well. They're planning it from abroad. So the plan, so they did decide to go ahead and have a rebellion in 1867. And the plan involved raiding Chester Castle, which was an arms dump for the British Army, and then moving these weapons to Ireland, where a rebellion then would break out in February of 1867 across the country, and simultaneously there would be a mutiny in the British Army with Fenians who were embedded within it, and that would lead to a complete breakdown, and the British would leave Ireland. That's the plan. Just said down there at the bottom, a wee point for you to note, that as a result of emigration after the famine, many British cities had a huge Irish community. And one estimate that I've read said that as many as 50,000 Fenian members or sympathisers live within an mile radius of Manchester alone. Okay, so that's the context for this, and it's another impact of the famine, I suppose. The person in charge of the Fenian raid was a man called Michael Davitt. Now, Michael Davitt will become important to us later when we look at Davitt in the Land League, as he works with Charles Stewart Parnell in the 1870s and 1880s. Just park that now. You don't need to understand that at the moment. And Davitt's plan was to take 50 Fenians and explode a bomb at the wall of the castle, get into the castle, remove the guns, and then ship them over through Holyhead on a ship to Ireland. But it says there in the red box at the bottom, the Fenians had an informer in the ranks and the authorities had been alerted, so the plan was aborted. Davitt and his 50 Fenians were forced to flee, but Davitt was later arrested and sentenced to 15 years in prison. There you can see. Okay. Despite this, Fenians and Kerry never heard about this event. Okay, so it's a different time where news travels a lot slower. But with the authorities alerted and with no arms gained from the raid, the rebellion plan for February in Ireland was put back until March. But the news didn't reach Kerry, where around 1,000 Fenians rose up as originally planned. And this only served to increase the alert level amongst the British forces in Ireland. Ireland was spelt there, and led to the arrest of more suspects. So you've got poor planning, poor communication, and I suppose with a secret organisation, it's difficult to get that information out. You remember Robert Emmet had that issue in his rebellion, where the need to keep it secret meant that it was difficult actually to organise a rebellion. Now, the rebellion then was postponed until March, but at this stage the authorities are pretty sure that something's happening. The garrison in Dublin has been increased. Soldiers are on alert. More precautions are being taken. The alert level is high. And when Fenians do gather in the west of Dublin on the night of the 5th of March, the police are ready. There were other things that affected the Fenians that night. It was snowing. Many of the men were armed with just revolvers and pikes. The weapons hadn't arrived because of the failure of the Chester Arm Raid. And if you read reports about the Battle of Tala, as it's referred to, it says many of the men marched not really realising what they were arriving at. And once the firing started, they just dropped their pikes and ran away. They weren't really committed to a rebellion. So why did the Fenian Rebellion fail? Well, it failed due to poor planning. We talked about the American thing, with it being planned in America and executed in England and Ireland. It's too complicated. The failure to acquire arms at Chester, infiltration by spies, poor communication, the condemnation of Paul Cullen in the Catholic Church, and also a lack of enthusiasm for rebellion, the inability to get mass support, and a lack of enthusiasm even amongst the rebels, as you see at the Battle of Tala, where many of the rebels just walk away, don't actually engage in battle. And I've sort of made a mess of this frame here. If I can just do something with this, I will quickly. I will just duplicate this slide. I'm going to remove this bit. Bear with me. Right. One thing that does come out of the 1867 rebellion, however, is the Manchester martyrs, and the Manchester martyrs leave a legacy which is pretty important. Who the Manchester martyrs were? Well, there were these three guys here who were executed later in 1867 after trying to free Thomas Kelly from a prison van. You see it up here in the picture. In Manchester. Kelly was the leader of the 1867 rebellion, and he was arrested a number of months after the rebellion in Manchester. Apparently he was recognised by his American boots. I don't know if that story is true or not, but he was arrested, and as he was being moved from the prison to the court, 50 Fenians attacked the carriage and tried to release him. You can see one up on top of the roof there trying to get him out. And they couldn't get him out, so the door obviously in the carriage was locked, so they shot through the lock and shot a policeman inside who was actually looking through the lock. So they accidentally killed a policeman in the process of releasing Kelly. They got Kelly out of the van. But in the following weeks, the police carried out raids and arrested 3 men and charged them with the murder of the policeman. And we don't really need to go into the details of the trial, but these 3 were then executed in Manchester outside the prison on a scaffold high up, a public execution. And with 2 of them being very, very light, framed people, the executioner had to jump on their shoulders to break their neck. So it was quite a horrific story. And as was common then, the bodies of executed prisoners were buried inside the prison walls, so their bodies never made it back to Ireland. But what it's remembered for is the cry from the dock. As the men were being sent down, as death was pronounced upon them, the 3 of them shouted, "God save Ireland," with raised fists. And that a song was written shortly afterwards to the tune of an American Civil War song called "God Save Ireland." "God Save Ireland," cried the heroes. Okay, and I think I put a video of that song up there from the Wolf Tones for you to listen to for a bit of fun. But that became like an unofficial anthem for Irish nationalism afterwards, and it sort of got a lot of people's sympathy for the Fenian cause. It changed everything in Ireland, and it even changed the church's attitude to the Fenians as sympathy poured out for these 3 young men who gallantly died upon the gallows for Ireland. Okay, this again is a wee snippet from Wikipedia. You'd be thinking your teacher only uses Wikipedia, but it was just handy today. It says the executions gave rise to enormous groundswell of feeling amongst Irish communities all over the world. In New Zealand, for example, 7 men were convicted of unlawful assembly in a high-profile trial following a mock funeral to Hokitika Cemetery. 2 of the 7, a newspaper editor and a priest, pleaded guilty to seditious libel, having published a succession of very rabid articles about the Queen's government. So that's just stuff that's happening abroad. What's happening in Ireland is probably more important. It says the vice-regal government declared the holding of a Manchester martyr funeral procession illegal. Throughout Ireland, masses, even public ones, were set for the 3, although Bishop David Moriarty of Kerry prohibited celebration of mass for them in his diocese. Archbishop John McHale of Tuam, on the other hand, personally assisted at a high mass for them, and Cardinal Archbishop Paul Cullen of Dublin, while opposing public celebrations, instructed his priests to pray for the dead Fenians and to say mass privately for them. So there was lots of mock funerals held in Ireland. Different towns and cities held funeral masses and funeral processions for these 3 Manchester martyrs who were buried now behind a prison wall in Manchester. So that has a huge emotional effect or a huge psychological effect on how people view the 1867 rebellion. It was a failure, but it left a huge legacy. And it's the legacy of the IRB and the Fenians, which is really, really important. I'm going to skip past this slide. If you want to go back to that, you can look at it, but I've done it more graphically here. So we already mentioned Michael Davitt, who was involved in the Chester Arms Raid, but once he's released from prison, he comes back to Ireland and he gets involved in the Land League with Charles Stewart Parnell, and we'll talk a lot about him later. Many Fenians then start to get involved in cultural activities, cultural and sporting activities. So the GAA, which formed in 1884, was formed with a lot of Fenian influence in the background. Even in politics, when we go on to look at Charles Stewart Parnell and his policy of obstructing Parliament, some of his MPs were quite high-ranking Fenians. This guy here, Joseph Biggar, he's got a hunchback there in this cartoon, but he actually was a hunchback. Joseph Biggar was an MP from Belfast, an Irish MP from Belfast, and became very, very famous in the 1880s, obstructing Parliament with very, very long speeches going on for hours and hours. So you've got a merging of constitutional nationalism and militant Irish republicanism. And these 3 figures in the middle here, you should know them. Patrick Pearse, Patrick Pearse, down here in the corner, leader of the 1916 rebellion, a member of the Fenian Brotherhood, a member of the IRB, and the guy who gave that speech at the gravesite of O'Donovan Ross in 1915, where he talked about life springing from death. The fools they leave us are Fenian dead. So that influence there. Michael Collins, a president of the IRB, okay, whilst he was in negotiations with the British over a treaty. Thomas Clark, the guy who headed up the military council of the IRB and planned the 1916 Rising. So they're very, very influential, the Fenians, after this, and they go on to have a huge impact in Irish history. But they also have an impact on another guy, this man here, Gladstone. Gladstone is probably the one of the greatest prime ministers that Britain ever had, and he dominates British politics from late 1860s right through to the 1880s. He was prime minister 4 times, and on coming to power in 1868, Gladstone announces that it was his mission to pacify Ireland, to bring peace to Ireland, and he sets about a period of reform where he tackles the issues of the Irish Church, the Church of Ireland. He tackles the issue of the land with Land Acts, and eventually in 1886 he instigates the first Home Rule Bill. I've given out this timeline to everybody who's been in class this last while, but if you don't have a copy of this, I have one for you. So Gladstone is hugely important because he is the first British Prime Minister to actively try and break the Union by the instigation of a Home Rule Bill for Ireland in 1886. So that's the Fenians. Again, it's important that you know why the rebellion failed. Lots of different reasons. It's important you know the influence that the church had on them. It's important that you know how the British government reacted to them. But it's important then that you understand their legacy afterwards and how they impact everything else. And as we go through from the Fenian Revolt through to Gladstone's first Home Rule Bill in 1886, this timeline over the next month or so, you'll constantly be meeting figures who were involved with the Fenian Rebellion or who had contact with the Fenian Rebellion. So you'll know how to fit the Fenian Rebellion into any discussion about their influence in this period. Okay, guys, I just thought that might be helpful to anybody who hasn't been able to get to class. And if there's any issues that you have, please get in contact with me through Google Classroom. I'll not be able to do videos like this every day. I'm only able to do it today because we got an unexpected day off, but I'm assuming we're going to be back at school. And when I'm at school full time, I just can't do this. Okay, so all the best, and we'll stop it there.